Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Pierre Menard, the author of the Quixote, begins by enumerating and to some degree describing the visible work or oeuvre of this author. And he gets a very interesting description at the start. The visible oeuvre left by this novelist can be easily and briefly enumerated, and then we're going to find out that there is an inadequate catalog of his works that has been put out by Madame Henri Bachelier in a deceitful catalog with omissions and additions that a certain newspaper whose Protestant leanings are surely no secret has been so inconsiderate as to inflict on that newspaper's deplorable readers, right? And the author goes on to say, Menard's true friends, which would include him, have greeted the catalog with an alarm and even with a degree of sadness. And so he says, I'm going to set the record straight in this case. And he says, I don't have a great authority, but I can at least bring up two testimonials. The Baroness de Bacour, and he says she's been so kind as to approve the lines that follow, and likewise the Countess de Bagnoregio, one of the rarest and most cultured spirits of the Principality of Monaco, now of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, following her recent marriage to the international philanthropist Simon Couch, right? So both of them are giving their blessing to this proper enumeration. And he's going to tell us that I have actually examined Menard's personal files with the greatest care, and I've established that his body of work consists of the following pieces, which we're going to look at briefly in just a moment. Suffice it to say, it's a list of 18 works, each of which is designated by a letter, a lowercase letter, and they are in chronological order, beginning from 1899 and going to roughly 1934. So, is that the totality of his works? He mentions two other things. So, one of these is a few vague sonnets of occasion destined, now notice the repetition of this name, for Madame Henri Bachelier's hospitable or greedy album des souvenirs, right? Now, what's a vague sonnet? It is a sonnet that is about vague matters, perhaps. It's certainly not something that isn't quite a sonnet, because then it simply wouldn't be a sonnet. A sonnet requires a certain structure to it, and we do find out that Pierre Menard has written quite a few sonnets. So that's a little bit of a ambiguity there. But then we also learn, and this is what the bulk of the story is going to be about, that Pierre Menard also wrote parts of the Don Quixote. And you might say, well, no, wait a second. Cervantes wrote the Quixote. Menard could reproduce them or perhaps plagiarize them. Specifically, we're talking about the 9th and the 38th chapters of Part 1 and a fragment of Chapter 22. And we'll get to that, precisely what he's talking about, as we explore the less visible, the subterranean work, as it's called. But he's succeeded in carrying out part of that, and that's not in the listing of things that he has successfully written and in many cases published. So what are the visible works? We'll read through them, and then we'll talk about some of the commonalities of them in a bit. A symbolist sonnet that appeared twice with variants in the review Le Conque. B, a monograph on the possibility of constructing a poetic vocabulary from concepts that are neither synonyms nor periphrastic locutions for the concepts that inform common speech, but are rather ideal objects created by convention essentially for the needs of poetry. C, a monograph on certain connections or affinities between the philosophies of Descartes, Leibniz, and John Wilkins. D, a monograph on, notice who's repeating here, Leibniz's Characteristica Universalis. E, a technical article on the possibility of enriching the game of chess by eliminating one of the rook's pawns. What happens there? Menard proposes, recommends, debates, and finally rejects this innovation. That's a kind of curious one, right? Why bring it up at all if you're going to reject your proposal? Well, we'll come to that in a bit. F, a monograph on Raymond Lull's Ars Magna Generalis. Now, this was a early modern work that many people were quite fascinated by, including Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who we've already encountered here. G, a translation with introductions and notes of Roy Lopez de Segura's Libro de la Invención Liberal e Arte de Yugo del Ajedrez. Ajedrez, perhaps, right? Which is a book about chess. So he's translated this into French. H, drafts of a monograph on George Boole's symbolic logic. I, a study of the essential metrical rules of French prose, illustrated with examples taken from Saint-Simon. Now notice what comes after this. J, a reply to Luc Durantin, who had countered that no such rules existed, illustrated with examples taken from Luc Durantin. So he's showing up somebody who's a critic. K, a manuscript translation of Quevedo's Aguja de Navegar Cultos, titled La Boussole des Précieux. So this is a short piece that is making fun of preciosity, of unnecessarily flowery language. It's a satirical piece, right? L, a forward to the catalog of an exhibit of lithographs by Carlos Horcade. M, a work entitled Les Problèmes d'un Problème, so literally, the problems of a problem, which discusses in chronological order the solutions to the famous problem of Achilles and the tortoise. This is Zeno's paradox, right? 2 editions of this work have so far appeared. The second bears an epigraph consisting of Leibniz's advice, Ne craignez point, monsieur la torture, and brings up to date the chapters devoted to Russell and Descartes. Now, Leibniz's dictum there, notice it is Leibniz again being brought up, is, oh, mister, don't worry, don't fear the tortoise. And a dogged analysis of the syntactical habits of Toulet. Menard, I recall, affirmed that censure and praise were sentimental operations that bore not the slightest resemblance to criticism. O, a transposition into Alexandrines of Paul Valéry's Cimetière Marin. So he's taking one poet's work and transposing them into a different meter, a different scheme, followed by another thing having to do with Paul Valéry, a diatribe against Paul Valéry in Jacques Rabel's Fouille pour la suppression de la réalité, which diatribe, I might add parenthetically, states the exact reverse of Menard's true opinion of Valéry. Valéry understood this, and the two men's friendship was never imperiled. Q, a definition, in quotes, of the Countess de Badeno Reggio. In the triumphant volume, the phrase is that of another contributor, Gabrielle D'Annunzio, published each year by that lady to rectify the inevitable biases of the popular press and present to the world and all of Italy a true picture of her person, which was so exposed by reason of her beauty and her bearing to erroneous and or hasty interpretations. R, a cycle of admirable sonnets dedicated to the Baroness de Balcourt. Finally, S, a handwritten list of lines of poetry that owe their excellence to punctuation. So we find a number of common themes here. He's very interested in language and languages. He carries out translation from Spanish to French, but he also transposes within the same language, French to French, poetry. And he's interested in the possibilities of constructing a new language for poetry as well. And this leads us to invention. The reference to Raymond Lull's work has to do with how to invent or discover things. Leibniz's Characteristica Universalis is also similarly about that. And we could say that a lot of what the poets are doing, but also perhaps those producing arguments and paradoxes, are interested in how we create things. Vocabulary is another issue that he is delving into. What is it to produce a term? Logic itself. And then finally, criticism. And I come back to that interesting point. Menard affirmed censure and praise were sentimental operations that bore not the slightest resemblance to criticism. So what is criticism actually supposed to do? Not give, yes, this is wonderful, oh, this is awful, kind of sentimental verdicts, but rather to say what's going on in a work of poetry, in a novel, in something like that, to get to the structure, the ontology of it, we might say. There are a few things that stand out in this list, and I think it's worth dwelling on them because it helps give us hints about what Borges is telling us in the rest of the story as we move to the, as he's going to call it, subterranean work, his unfinished work of writing the Quixote. So we have this problem of one of Zeno's paradoxes, right? The Achilles and the tortoise. If you don't know that one or you're a little hazy on it, so Achilles is chasing a tortoise and they're having a race. Achilles gives the tortoise a little bit of a head start. And he should still pass him up, right? Because Achilles is the fastest runner. The tortoise is a slow animal. But Zeno says that Achilles will never catch the tortoise. Because by the time that Achilles gets to where the tortoise is, well, the tortoise has moved on a little bit more. And by the time Achilles crosses that point, the tortoise has moved on a bit more. And we might see in this a suggestive symbol of the possibility of ever getting to the complete bottom of anything. And then we get to a more complicated matter. This diatribe against Paul Valery, stating the exact reverse of Menard's true opinion of Valery. Why would you write a piece of criticism that states the exact opposite of what your views are? Well, perhaps you're doing it satirically. Queveto's work is making fun of preciosity, making fun of flowery language, but Quevedo himself could indulge in that sometimes. We also see, interestingly, this dialectic at work. So Menard writes a piece, a study of the essential metrical rules of French prose, and Luc Durtin, responds and says, there are no such rules. And then Menard says, oh, here's some examples of that, and these are taken from that very critic's works. Well, that is pretty interesting, is it not? And, we might also think about this technical article on the possibility of enriching the game of chess, eliminating one of the rook's pawns. So Menard proposes it. Then he recommends it. That goes beyond proposing. He's providing arguments for it. Then he debates it, and then he rejects it, right? So similar to this diatribe in a certain way. The third thing that I think really stands out is this definition of Countess de Bagnoregio. And this is where knowing something about Leibniz, who is the most often referenced person in Pierre Menard's visible works is quite helpful. Leibniz made a number of different assertions, many of which are quite interesting. But Leibniz thought that we could have something like a definition of an individual human being, other things as well. Usually we think of definitions as applying to classes of things like dog or human being or book. But what if we could take an individual object and describe it in all of its characteristics exhaustively? Would that not be a definition of that object? Now, is he actually carrying that out of this countess? No, because we human beings are not capable of going into such great detail. Leibniz says that a full analysis of all of the things that pertain to a human being could only be carried out by God. But it is a possibility, and it actually does exist. So we can have definitions of a person that get closer and closer to that. And now this getting closer and closer to it, perhaps that's hinted at by the Achilles and the tortoise, and the fact that Menard has surveyed all of these solutions to the problem, including those of Descartes and Bertrand Russell. So we get a number of interesting hints provided in what it is that Menard himself has produced and published. What don't we find there? We go back to the first sentence. The visible oeuvre left by this novelist. Is there a novel in that list? No, there isn't at all. So why should we call him a novelist? Why should that be the first descriptor of this person? A critic, an essayist, a translator? All of those seem to be more apt. Well, this has to do with the fact that he is writing, in some respect, as yet to be determined, talked about later in the story, the Don Quixote. So if he is writing the Quixote, not merely copying it, then he is a novelist. But insofar as he hasn't finished it, is he really a novelist? Well, it kind of depends. Do you become a novelist by writing a few chapters and having a project in mind? Perhaps, right? So that's where we'll leave off. And next we'll talk about the other work of Pierre Menard.